Well, hello, and welcome to the Purposefully Human Radio Hour, where we get into discussions with interesting people on creating a more human world. I'm Neal Woodson, and with me is my co host, Jerry Seufert. Hi, Jerry. Do you have any news or thoughts to share from out in the West Coast?
Well, good morning, Neil. Always good to co-host with you. Uh, I don't know about news, but I wanted to thank you for recommending a book that I really enjoyed. Uh, uh, it was Hope for Cynics, and uh, the author. I recommend it to anyone. Uh, the author makes the point in the book that we are human. As humans, we are innately hopeful, but recent times have really clobbered our ability to be hopeful and turned many
Mhm.
people into walking cynics. And he gives very practical insights and advice on that. And the reason I bring it up is I think to be purposefully human is to be hopeful. And so it's a muscle that I think those of us in the community can work and strengthen and then encourage others to work on as well.
Well, I appreciate that, Jerry. I would also recommend his first book called The War for Kindness, which
Okay.
is largely about empathy and how that works and how we can actually practically grow that muscle as well. Um, Zaki is a professor at Stanford, and he just kind of goes nuts with research. He
Yes.
just does tons of research, and there's tons of data backing up all the stuff he does. And So I would recommend both of those books, The
Yeah.
War for
Good catch,
Kindness.
by the way. Yes, he's very thorough, and I really appreciated the the end matter in the book where he not only cites his sources, but he addresses uh, the strength of the evidence, which
Yeah, and he usually, and I think in this book and the other one too, he will go through chapter by chapter, kind of chapter and verse about where this came from, where this
yeah,
data
yeah,
came from.
yeah,
So
he does that in Hope for Cynics. Yep.
so
What about you? What's going on with
I
you?
I don't really have any news. I guess the big thing for me that from from a purposefully human perspective this week, I think it was this week, was the release of the hostages in Gaza, and
Mm-hmm.
at minimum, regardless of your leanings, whoever, whatever your leanings are out there, I think uh, it holds out some hope that maybe there's peace coming. And so I certainly want to hold out that hope that there's peace, especially as
Yeah,
we head into the holidays. And it's a time, it really is a time for peace and for focusing on that. So I certainly hope to see that happen.
I share your thoughts. I mean, the underneath the global implications and the politics and all that, there are human stories there,
Yeah.
and very personal ones, familial ones, and I have to imagine that the people, the hostages themselves and the people waiting for them back home, were tested, and I imagine that their hope uh, might have faltered at times, but in time, again, on a personal level, hope did win. So I agree. That's very affirmational.
So before we have a great guest coming up today. Jerry, I know he's a friend of both of ours, and I know he's a pretty tremendous guy. But before we meet our guest, I want to mention that this program comes to you from the Purposefully Human community, which is a group committed to giving people a voice in creating a more human world and more humane organizations. And you can find out more at purposefullyhuman.com or on LinkedIn by searching for Purposefully Human. So without further ado, let's talk about today's program. We have a great guest, and his name is David Wales. And David describes himself as a human behavior, motivation, and experience specialist. He's the founder of the international consultancy Shared Aim Limited. He's also the founder of the Purposeful Human Community. And in a past life, He worked in the fire and rescue service in the UK, where he introduced them to the concept of customer experience. David, welcome to the radio hour. Love having you here.
Thank you, Neil. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You know, I want to begin our conversation by asking you to tell us just a little bit more about the fire service and how you went from that to customer experience and the work you do now. So if you could just give us a little background.
Of course, and thank you for the introduction. It wasn't a planned journey. I think it's probably worth saying. It's not something I envisaged all those years ago, but it started with a question that intrigued me. We were discussing public behaviour and how people responded to fires and how we could help reduce injuries through that. And a colleague, in somewhat exasperation, said, "Why don't they just do as they're told? Clearly, as professionals, we know what's best for them. If they just followed our guidance, it would be well." And it fascinated me as a question because I was 20 years into a career and I'd learned the science of my job, I learned the technical side of my job, but I realised I had no understanding of what a fire meant to somebody or what their experience was. Because I joined because I wanted to do that job. So a fire for me was a chance to do the activities I trained for. And it just, one of those moments where it really dawns on you. And I was able to take it on as a research project, starting out locally, with a view, I think, that I'd go back to the board with an answer to the question where we could then provide the right education to correct the behaviour outside. Over the next 6 years, we developed it from a local to a national study involving a 3-year partnership with the university. And at the end of that, perhaps the biggest insight for me was that we lost an understanding and connection with the people we serve. We understood the fire as an event to put out. We never understood what it was like when we drove away, patting ourselves on the back, with a person whose life has been absolutely altered that day and for the weeks and months and possibly years ahead. And even very small fires had that impact. And I think by the third interview I undertook, it completely altered my perception and understanding my job and ignited a passion in me to share that message. And so by the time I went back to the board, it felt like I'd been pulling at a string for about 6 years and said, actually, everyone we spoke to, if you hear their circumstances, their priorities, what was on their mind at the time, they make perfect sense. There's no irrational behaviour. People are actually generally quite competent. They're doing a good job generally. But I've got questions about our beliefs and understandings, because that seems to me where the problem now lies, that we're responsive to legislation and downward pressures. We haven't really got that human piece. And a simple example of that was really, the advice was, if you have a fire in the home, just leave your pet. Well, you can imagine the first 10 people I spoke to all had small fires and received small injuries. Of those, 8 had pets. 7 of them said not only was the pet a concern in deciding their behaviour, it was the most important driver of their behaviour. So you had this advice which is well-meaning, but ultimately not working. And that gap is something that I was intrigued to how to bridge, because we'd forgot really that for some people that pet is no different to a person. Mm-hmm. And their choices about deciding to try and save it, what it means to save it, what it means to lose it, are all the same as they would apply to a person. And that's really, really fundamental if we wanted to communicate. And so there's lots of examples that the public gave me like along those lines. And by the end of the 6 years, we had a lot of insights, including the key one I mentioned. What I no longer had was a budget. And I thought, so how do I get to grips with what some of this means? What's our next step in doing something about it? And it occurred to me that we weren't having to learn something new, although our context was different. Others were doing this. The big companies were doing this and spending lots on customer experience. So I started going along to the events and met some incredible people in the customer experience sector, some very generous people with time and knowledge, and realised that there's a lot we could use that other people have done and import. And through that mechanism, I was appointed as far as I know, the first ever customer experience manager in a fire and rescue service to introduce the mindset and models around customer experience. When I left the service 6 years ago, I did some work in customer experience, but if I'm honest, I'd found the human piece hard to, I suppose, find a community around. There's lots around the technical side and the technology. The human piece to me felt a little bit lost, and I wasn't really sure who my tribe was. And so I put in a post and asked, I keep reading a lot about human-centered design, human experience, rehumanize, dehumanize, as we're coming out of the pandemic. I said, what is this human we talk of? How do we define that? Because it's, in some ways, it appeared to me like culture. You can't just say we have culture as a company. You have to understand what it means to you, your customers, your employees. You have to be able to articulate it, define it, and everyone have a common enough view of what that means to be able to deliver to any promises you make. But we seem to be using human in a similar way, but without defining it. And increasingly, companies were putting some form of human into their slogans or their campaigns, but without really understanding what that could mean. And I was intrigued whether that could be something as basic as I would treat others as I would like to be treated, which can work in some circumstances, but has limitations. Or was it a particular set of defined traits that people had? And the responses we got were really encouraging. They ranged from somebody who said, I've never thought about this, through to people that have written books. And I know, of course, you've written a book on the subject that's very relevant to this topic as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it just felt that as I followed up with people in calls and emails, that there was a semblance that we need somewhere to gather for people that have this idea that we could be more human in the way that we work. There was a lack of somewhere to really gather around. And so that was really the origin of Purposefully Human.
Now that's a heck of a story. But all of it, I really love the journey, and I like, what you learned all along the way. And it reminds me of there's a guy in the United States. He's a former police officer. I'm not sure if he's still a police officer or not. His name is Chip Huth, and Chip Huth, he's involved with the Arbinger Institute, who wrote the book Leadership and Self-Deception, The Outward Mindset. And anyway, he tells the story. He was a police officer in the Kansas City Police. He was the leader of a SWAT team. And what he found was that the communities they were working in saw the police as enemies, not as partners. And he began to, wonder what's going on. Why is this the case? And what's happening here? And what he found was that they're not seeing people as people. They're seeing them as immediately as, they're making the assumption you're a criminal, you're bad, everybody was bad. It had that cynical view of, the world is a bad place and these are bad people. And it just wasn't working. And they began to change that mindset to be, how do we be better community members? How do we begin to see people rather than seeing them as obstacles or a means to an end or whatever? We begin to just see them as people, with needs and challenges and fears and all of those things that everybody has. And they have had tremendous results from that. They have had I believe they've had more arrests, but they've had more cooperation in the community, and they've had a whole bunch of measurable results to include in that as well. That it's a really, really surprising story, but it's very similar to what you described. Here they are, they're not really paying attention to, well, there are people on the other end of everything they're doing. Every one of these people that they're arresting has a family or has, parents or whatever it is. And there are people that are connected to them, and they're not thinking about those other people. They're not thinking about what they're doing to the community and to families and things like that. And so it's really interesting to see what can happen when we begin to move and change that mindset.
Yeah, that's a really encouraging story. And I still do some in advisory work for international crisis and disaster projects, and particularly looking at how organizations or professionals work with volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a similar thing to you've mentioned, that actually the biggest impediment is perhaps the attitude of the professionals towards the communities, that they're not trusting them,
Right.
that there's a sense of leave it to professionals. It reminds me in some ways of companies where you've created these silos and you spend more energy trying to overcome the silo than you do working on the joint solution. And particularly in crises and disasters, some of these are very quick and sudden, some of them are quite prolonged, and obviously the scale of the ones we're seeing at the moment has increased. But what one of the things we've recognized is they failed to see that as professionals, you choose to work a certain way, and that makes perfect sense. Communities come together in a different way, less structured, less formal, nonetheless very effective. And quite often you see in crisis and disasters that professionals want volunteers or community members to behave and work into their systems. That becomes a point of friction, and it becomes self-perpetuating that professionals then say, well, it's really hard to work with volunteers. And it's because you're trying to force two systems together to work one way rather than respecting that they're just different. And there's a different sort of interface.
You're also working against culture. Every community, families, communities, schools, everything builds cultures, right? You have systems and ways of working. You have things that, this is our community culture. And you come in like this, you're this outsider, and you come in and you impose these things. And now we're enemies. Now we're fighting against each other because you're not working with the system, you're working against it. Or you're not working with our system, you're working against it.
And there's a couple of questions that can really break through some of that, which is just taking the time to sit with the community and say, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? What would a good outcome look like? So that we can get that, because there are different, although there's a common aim of resolve the disaster, there are different facets to it. A professional body has statutory requirements to achieve. It will have certain pressures on it. It will have to manage the media. That's fine. Communities will want a different thing. They will see a longer tail to it because they'll still be there when the initial response is gone. They'll understand that recovery a bit better. So I think asking that question and then really, so how could we go about addressing those, but really committing to it being a joint project or a joint initiative rather than this is what we do, and then when we're done, you can take over, because that really works. And I think, as I say, what I found fascinating is they all transfer straight across into commercial businesses and other sectors as well. So where I came from public sector and learned from customer experience, equally the same then comes back the other way. And it's a continual, for me, dynamic environment, which one bit of knowledge informs one thing, I can take it somewhere else and then come back in a slightly different form.
Well, I think
it's people, as you mentioned.
It comes down to we're all just people. Yes. So it really doesn't matter industry to industry. It doesn't matter. We're all still dealing with basic fundamental human interaction, and whether it's in a tragedy and a disaster or whether it's in a sale, you're still working with human beings. And so, which leads me to my first question. This is kind of a big question, but we talk about being purposefully human. And all you see it on the screen here 3 times, purposefully human. I want to know, what is your definition of purposefully human, and what does that mean to you exactly?
That's a great question. And in some ways, what it means to me doesn't matter for the purpose of the organization, doesn't matter too much. We took an early decision, and Jerry's been alongside me from the start and been a fantastic source of support and knowledge and guidance. And we took a view quite early on that it wasn't for us to define what we meant by human or necessarily purposefully human, because we can only bring our perspective. And in terms of our current audience and hope or anticipated audience, we trust that they will be able to apply and understand what it means to them, and they will bring different perspectives. But for me, it's about recognizing, as you say, beyond the personas and other ways that people in some ways create convenience in the way they understand humans in organizations. Our messy edges are what make us unpredictable, diverse. But if you take those away, you lose the essence of what that person is. So one of my early articles was, I'm never just a customer. I never go into that. You get all of me. You'll get the bits that you may know or be able to discover. There's also internal influences you'll never understand in terms of my lived experience, my values. I think one of the unhelpful concepts is this idea of the rational human. And by contrast, if you don't behave in a way that organizations expect, you're irrational, therefore there's something to correct. That misses the essence of it. So there are some things that will be on the table, but in all but the most simple transactions, there will be a range of features in my mind. I'm not irrational if I want to pay £5 more for something. It may just be a conscious choice related to my values or some other part that, as a professional you haven't imagined or haven't anticipated. So I think to answer your question, for me, Purposely Human is being taking the time to really understand in whatever organization you are, where you use that, what does that actually mean? And there's a nice story I think there's in some ways captured. I was speaking to someone recently, and he said 40 years ago he joined an organization, intended to stay a couple of years. And fairly early on, he had to go for a doctor's appointment. And his boss said, "Do you mind if I have a look at that?" And the appointment was 16 weeks away. So she said, "Can I make a couple of calls?" And he said, "Of course." And she came back later that day and said, "If you're free tomorrow, we can pay for you to have an appointment." He was over the moon. And he said, from that day, I felt recognized, valued, and seen. I stayed, and he stayed 16 years. And you know that if ever the organization said, we need a bit of help here, he would have been the first to put his hand up and join them. So I think recognizing that we're not a standard version of a standard person.
Mm-hmm.
Who we are changes every day with the latest news, good, bad, people that we're with, that can change our influences. And I think organizations perhaps need to be more aware of that and more intentional in how they design it. And the idea of a knowable customer persona has huge limitations. I think we need to design that uncertainty back in, because I would suggest that a lot of the problems businesses face are as a result of the cost and disruption of not really having an authentic understanding of humans and people. And that creates tensions where actually you're often arguing about different things. But the reverse of it is, although we're quite, I suppose, diverse and dynamic, that is the very feature as well that companies benefit from. When they create the conditions for that to be a positive thing, that's where the moments of inspiration come from. That's where the innovation unlocks. That's where teams do exceptional things. So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done to really harness that. And I would say, and I know you've talked about this before, Neil, as well, if you take a historical view, I don't think in a broad sense, I don't think organizations have ever really got that piece right.
Well, there's a ton to unpack here. But a couple things jumped out at me. Yesterday, Jerry and I were in a meeting together with a group, and we talked at length about something I call the iceberg and the iceberg principle. And the iceberg principle is that what we see of people is typically just 10%. And that under the surface, there's a lot more going on that we know nothing about, right? And businesses do this all the time. You know, you go to work for a company and they say, leave your emotions at the door, which is absurd. Humans you can't do it. You can't leave your emotions. We are emotional creatures. And you spoke to a couple of things here. One, you talked about the rational human. And a lot of that comes from, like it or not, I don't know what your economic view is in life, but neoliberal economics talks about, and it assumes people are rational, that we make rational decisions and rational choices, when science tells us that we actually don't. It is a piece of how we do things, but more often than not, we make emotional choices and we make emotional decisions. And so our emotions have a ton to do with how we interact with each other and how we choose things, whether it's in a sale or whether it's a mate or whatever. So much of it has to do with emotion, which is we can't measure, and people don't like things you can't measure. You know, that's a big problem. But anyway, going back to this principle, the iceberg is, you talked about something that I wrote down, the phrase intentional consideration. And you talked about companies, if they could make consideration of people being human and make that more intentional and make it more an intentional part of their culture, what kind of shift would that have? Which, to me, goes right back to this idea of being purposefully human, because, and I know you and I have talked about this before, the purposeful part is so much about intention. It's not about just doing this by accident. It's by intentionally making this a habit in your life, making this part of how you go about doing things and how our cultures work, et cetera. And it always starts with doing something intentionally. And then it becomes just a part of the way you do things, right? But we have to kind of start doing it intentionally, I think.
And there's a nice parallel at the moment. If you look at the general environment in which businesses are working, huge amounts of uncertainty. So the idea of a predictable world and a stable world is something that most organizations don't have the luxury of anymore. So it feels that as they go through that mindset shift, it's also time to revisit what they understand humans to be, because that's no different. And I think if you look at a lot of the technology, organizations have good intentions generally. They are spending millions, if not billions, on trying to improve things. But something's not working. I hear so often that people are having very poor customer experience or employee experience. And I think it's not by accident. My hunch is that what the rapid automation and scaling of businesses is doing is exposing the flaws in our understanding of human very quickly. That the models we've used and been able to get away with on personas and things have been close enough at a certain pace and scale. That is getting, even quite small differences get exposed now, because we should be seeing customers and employees happier than ever, given the investment that's been made in the last 5 or 6 years. But it's not happening. And if you look wider in society, the automation and things is not generally making people more content. And your point quickly about emotions, I think, is a really key area. The idea that data will tell us everything. We spoke before about sport. Every sport now is analyzed and has huge amounts of data. To an extent, you would get to the point where you could do the data, you wouldn't need to go to a match or see the game, because you've got the stats on the two teams. You could crunch the numbers, save us all the traveling, save us all the anticipation, the disappointment, the watching, the standing in the cold or the walk. But it's not that, because moments in the game change because of emotion, whether the crowd gets behind one person, something happens, a bad decision. That's why we go to watch sport. It's not a technical event. It's because we know there's unpredictability in it somewhere, that the underdog has a day where they can beat the person that was never meant to.
That's why they play the
And
game.
I think,
Mhm.
yeah,
Well, but this is kind of like the difference between going to a live concert and listening to a recording. There's a big difference in that. And people, what's funny is there was a time when people thought that recordings were going to end live performance. That was going to be the end of live performance. Hasn't happened. People still go to concerts, and people will go to a concert and listen to the same exact songs that they can go home and listen to. You know, they can stream off the internet or whatever, but they still go to the live concert. So there's something there, and it's something you can't measure. You can't, we can't put a number on that. That was a 10, I guess you could back in the day of American Bandstand, that was a 10, but the human experience and the human to human energy, call it whatever you want. That may be a little too spiritual for some people, but I believe that there's an energy that's there that you can't reproduce just in a recording.
Hey Neil, quick story to build on something David said about we've made all these investments, and you would expect us to be the happiest and most satisfied in all of history. Well, the other day I did call a contact center, and I went through the trees and got to the point where I had to say I want to talk to a person, and I eventually got there, and they led with what I'm sure was their training, like, how can I help you today? That was the peak of the experience. And I realized, having had to force my question through the trees, and they were asking, as David said, they were asking me to define my need on their terms. And then I thought about the conversation later, and I realized I have never in a customer service interaction been asked, how can I satisfy your concerns today? Which would be an open-ended question. Well, I'd like this to happen, and I'd like this to happen. And then let them figure out what category that goes in, and even if they can do it. But it's interesting. David, I love the two systems in collision metaphor there, because I'm sure this organization, it's a financial services company, I'm sure they've spent a fortune building these customer-facing portals into their business. And at the end of the day, after all of this, they were forcing me to define my concern on their terms so that they could answer things that they were prepared to answer in predictable ways, as opposed to, when this call is over, sir, what do you want the new state to be? What would satisfy you? What would, and the implication obviously is, what would you tell your friends about us because of this conversation?
Yeah. So what can you do for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, without saying it, but
yeah, but they are saying it. They're just not saying it
well,
directly.
they are, but they're saying it in the wrong way. I mean, I should reach that conclusion on my own. I had a great experience, and I'm going to tell people, hey, next time you're looking for a financial services company,
call these guys.
Yeah, I had a great experience with these guys, as opposed to the usual way that conversation goes these days. They're all bad. I don't know if you're ever in conversation with people about their financial services provider, but with the possible exception of some credit union organizations, at least in North America, that's the default. They're all bad. And I have to wonder, to David's point, if that isn't a not incidental outcome of all these investments in so-called customer service.
You're now leading right into kind of my big question number 2 for David.
It's almost like I knew you were going to ask him.
Yeah, no, but you, I know you, Jerry. I know you know what I'm going to ask, but I know you just were talking, and just amazingly, it just does that. You have this way. But David, what kind of underlies all this, from all the things you've experienced and are continuing to experience? What's causing this? What's causing these problems? What lies at the root of why we need to be more purposefully human?
I think it in simple terms, it's because where we're heading is not inevitable. At times it can feel like that. I think there are, in some cases, quite small tweaks of knowledge and practice that could be made that would be beneficial for organizations, for the people that interact with them, and wider society. Mm-hmm. Because if we assume that generally good intention is there behind the investments that are made, the investments aren't necessarily hitting the mark. And I think it's an organizational blind spot that we.
But why is that? Look back, why are organizations? Why are they not paying attention to? And I think in an even broader way, not just in a financial services way, but why aren't they paying attention to the humans that are behind everything that? Because everything that they do, any business, is about human beings, and humans are getting lost in all this. What's going on? Why is this?
Yeah, I think, and we spoke before, and you've quite rightly said that it actually is a historical trend to this, that this is not necessarily new, that relationship between humans and organizations has, I call it the human organization gap. Mm-hmm. And when you look at an issue from both perspectives, you can quite often see difference in values and priorities and criteria and resources and power. One of the interesting things for me at the moment with the technology and the scale is it has really brought to light, I think, some of those deficiencies. One of my concerns, and possibly one of the reasons it becomes more, or people's experience is getting worse, the cost to the organization is less. So and I know, Jerry, you've been doing a lot of work on recruitment. Organizations can buy the technology now that leave me trapped in a recruitment process online, doing a series of tests that costs the organization nothing. It takes up my time, but if I'm getting frustrated, I may not be able to feed that back because it's a no reply email or it just drops out of the system. And I think organizations, in the way that they're investing in technology, are to an extent creating some of their own problems. And it's dynamic. Technology changes humans change technology. It is, as I say, constantly evolving. But one of the things that I see is this distance. I had to smile with your story earlier, Jerry. This morning, I have a complaint that an issue I'm trying to resolve and getting very frustrated by. This morning, I asked the company 8 times, can I have your customer complaint form? Only to be told, eventually, after speaking to the manager and all these things that apparently happened, you can do that with an agent. I said, well, I don't want to. I want to do it independently and submit it. Not an option. I think what's happening generally is that organizations are putting a real distance between them and the customers, because if you go back to the recruitment one, if I'm getting frustrated and I can call somebody and say, this system's really not working for me, the employee to an extent can understand my perspective, it becomes a bit of a pain for them to get my call and maybe other people's, and that transmits into the organization. But when technology and automated technology is the buffer, that pain never really gets through to the organization. The pain stays on the side of the customer or maybe the employee in certain circumstances. The technology creates that distance, the human organization gap. And I don't think organizations are really sensing it in the same way that people do, because the cost to serve, so you could trap me in with agentic AI and other things now. You can trap me in a process which never causes any problems to your organization, because on a human level, I'm just talking to the AI and the technology.
And it's here's what I'm hearing is essentially, the technology is great, but it can't have empathy because it's a machine. Only people can have empathy. Only people can feel your pain. The machine can't feel your pain. And that's a big gap. That's a big chasm between humans and the technology. We can use the technology and it's great. It does a lot of things, but the biggest thing it can't do is feel. And in certain situations, that's the prime thing that needs to happen, is for somebody to feel what you're feeling. Am I hearing that? Am I hearing that correctly?
And I think with Purposefully Human, again, we've really thought about our place in the world and what problem do we solve. And everyone will have view on technology, and when it works, it's amazing. When it doesn't, it's frustrating. Mm-hmm. We get that. We're not here as an organization to really respond to the technology agenda. We accept it's here, and like anything, some works, some doesn't. But what I would like us to continue to do is to present a really positive view of the benefits of celebrating and working with what it means to be human in an authentic way. And by that, I mean, if you took AI at the moment, a lot of the discussions are, what can AI do? Because the bits it can't do, we can leave to humans. I'd love to flip that round and say, what would a job look like that really appealed to a human? What degree of sociability do I need? What degree of exploration, new sort of work? What degree of working with other people? What is it that really hits and activates me? If you go back to some of the things like Maslow's hierarchy, what is it really motivates me to be the best version of me that I can? And how can AI enable that so that you've got an organization of people that are motivated, supported, valued? The AI supports that, or the technology supports that. Whereas I think at the moment it's flipped the other way around, which is unhelpful. So I think with Purposefully Human, we really want to present a vision of how things could be if you genuinely put humans at the heart. Because if we're not building organizations for humans, what are we building them for?
I have to say I really like that we want to present a vision of what it could be. I love the hope. I love the hope and all that. Which kind of leads me to the third thing. And that is, okay, we got these problems. We have essentially a focus on a lot of stuff that's not human. And what can we do practically, whether it's as individuals or whether it's as an organizations? What can we practically do to be more purposefully human? And this, I know that's a huge question, but I do think it needs to be individual, but it also needs to be organizational. So what would you suggest? What would be some suggestions that anybody could take away? Whether I'm, an individual contributor or whether I'm the CEO of a company, what are things that I can take away and potentially look at and do to move more in the direction of being purposefully human.
Oh, thank you. And I just qualify as well we're realistic about we have to appeal to business and demonstrate the benefits of a human approach to organizations. This isn't idealistic. It has to be rooted in practical benefits that an organization can gain from being better by working in a human way. And we have a longer term aim where maybe organizations would look fundamentally different. But right here and now, businesses have many, many challenges to deal with. Mm-hmm. And creating a view based on our vision of the world isn't one of them. So certainly for the next few years, our main focus will be looking at those small actions and differences that people can take away that doesn't require a budget, doesn't require board sign-off, that are actionable tomorrow. But the first thing it really comes down to is normalizing conversations about the human side of it. And that could be simply as, well, how did it feel when we introduced a new process that way? And just a quick story going back to some previous work I did. An organization was reviewing its discipline procedure, and it was a fairly standard review, expected to take about an hour. Nothing's changed. We just sign off. And we'd created some advocates to go in and really look at customer experience and human perspective. And we dropped them in on existing projects rather than creating a whole new lot of new ones. And the advocates was listening to how the plan was going. He said, you do know that when that happens, when the particular part of the discipline process kicks in, actually it's really difficult because you may know these people, even if you're found innocent, the stigma sometimes never goes away in an organization that where people tend to stay a long time. What he introduced in a third party way was, so how does that feel? How does that actually work when it's people, not process? What are the things that people actually consider? And it went from being an hour to a longer project, but it uncovered things that explained why the process wasn't working, and quite often actually cost more time in reality than it would appear on paper. And it got people talking in a very different way. So one of the biggest things for me is just trying to find ways to normalize a conversation about the human aspect. It could be as simple as, that sounds a great plan, but how would that feel if you were this person? Or what does it look like to live without uncertainty? Or are we appealing to everyone, or are we leaving people behind? Whatever the context, but just not a long-winded one, but just to start slowly introducing the idea that if we think about it as people, it will introduce some new perspectives, new insights, and potentially new opportunities or solutions. One of the things I want to do with Purposefully Human, we certainly don't have all the answers, but by creating a focus and forum, we'd love to hear from other people as well, what they're finding works. What is it they've been able to do in an organization? I know there's a lot of science around some things as simple as try smiling. It has an impact on other people. Being courteous. It's your book, being prepared to be inconvenienced, to give up a bit of your time to help somebody else. The story I mentioned earlier about somebody that felt incredibly seen because the boss said, maybe I can get you an earlier appointment. These are small things, but as anything that you can do that just says to somebody else that you work with or serve, I see you, I respect you, and I can help you in some way. Compassion is great. I prefer compassion to empathy because it means you're trying to just help that person rather than necessarily understand their experience, because that's not always possible. But I think anything just to break us out of some of the ways of working. Language is another one for me. I'm not a fan of terms like onboarding and offboarding, when actually what we mean to say is welcome, and at the other end, thank you for everything you've done and good luck with your future. Offboarding doesn't capture that in a single way. The language you use to each other has a real difference.
I had a conversation, interesting online little conversation with a writer named Bob Berg. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He wrote a book called The Go-Giver. And he posed a question, he said, I don't really like the term onboarding. And he said, does anybody have alternative names? And I wrote in and I said, yeah, we should call it welcoming. Why do we call it onboarding? That just sounds clinical. Why don't we call it welcoming? Because that's what you're doing. That's what you're trying to do for a new employee. They come on board. No, I want to welcome you to the company. I want to welcome you to our team. I want you to feel welcome.
Another ongoing gift of the tech community, by the way.
What's that?
They gave us the term onboarding.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with it until I did some work with technology companies and like, what's this onboarding? You know, you mean like their first day? Their orientation? Is that the kind of stuff you're talking? And yeah, onboarding. And like, oh, okay, we have a new catchword.
It's a new clinical phrase that
Yeah,
it's probably measurable. That's, somehow you can measure it.
Well, I don't know if you're like you guys. I'm also fascinated by the importance and implications of word choices, and that word onboarding is now starting to seep into other segments of our lives, uh, like as a retail customer to a subscription service.
Right.
We now call that onboarding.
Right.
Yeah, as opposed to welcoming or orienting, or I'd rather be oriented than welcome, to be honest, than onboarding. So,
but as a new employee, I would like to be welcomed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially on day one. That, it's like that first day at school where you feel, everybody's watching me, everybody's looking at me. No, I want to be welcomed.
Yeah.
And it changes the metrics, and I think that's one of the other bits we looked at. That the way that it's set up at the moment, it gives the impression for organisations that they're in control of the experience. They could create the best experience on paper, but how I personally experience it will be dictated by how I turn up. The best news I've had, the worst news I've had. And so my response is a measure of how I'm feeling as much as the experience created. And so I think a lot of the metrics are flawed. And as you say that, I suppose one of the other bits that comes through to me just in terms of what we can do is in some ways a bit of a thought experiment to improve our tolerance for each other. And I often use the example of driving, that if somebody drives in an aggressive way and overtakes you and then cuts in, we'll often start thinking quite uncharitable thoughts and think, I'll put that politely. We never really
you
go
put
to
that
the
very
point,
politely, David. That's
but we never really think that maybe that person is in a rush. They've got to get to hospital. They've got an emergency. We default to what they've done to me. They caused me to stop, slow down, and I think sometimes sometimes they are a bad driver. Sometimes they are inconsiderate, but we never really default to that. So again, back to that intentionality of just sometimes when you see something that upsets you or triggers a response, it's worth just thinking, can I imagine a circumstance in which I would do that? Because if I can, it's possible that's what's caused that person, and it invites more of a conversation or an inquiry than a judgment.
Sure.
It's funny. I've done an exercise like that with people where I used to work in a hotel environment, and I'd travel around and train people and coach them on stuff like this. And they would always ask about customers. How can I, they would talk pretty poorly of customers. I mean, it was pretty bad. So I had them do an exercise where I said, I want you to list all the things that make a morning terrible for you. What are things that make a morning terrible? And they would list things like the weather, my kids, my spouse, the traffic, all these things that could get in their way and make a morning terrible. I said, so how do you appear to people when you have a morning like that? And they would say, well, I'm a jerk, or, whatever it is. They would say all these things. And I say, okay, now I want you to imagine you're a customer of yours. And I want you to think of all the things that might happen in a morning for them. And they would list a whole bunch of things. I'd say, so how do they appear to you when they've had a morning like that? And they would list, and I'd say, now I want you to look at the two side by side. It was amazing how similar they were. And all of a sudden it made it clear that, wait, these are people and they have the same issues and challenges that you do. All you're seeing is this little bit, and underneath it is all this other stuff that you have, that other stuff too. So in essence, we're all connected in that way. Yeah. And so it can change how we interact with others, how we deal with others. And you don't have to know why they're the way they are. You just have to know that they are that way. And then how do you deal with that? And it's like that person that cut you off on the freeway. Look, I don't need to know why they did it. What I need to do is think, that could be me. I know I've done it before when I was in a hurry, or I was, maybe this person, like you said, maybe they've got to get to an interview or something and they're just doing whatever they can to get to it. Or maybe they've got a sick relative, or maybe they're just a jerk. I don't know. I don't know. But it's not going to kill me to just say, you know what, let it go.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's giving respect and honor to that interval between stimulus and response.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to get angry. You don't have to shoot at their car. You don't have to do. You don't have to race and get in front of them and then slow down and hit your brakes. You don't have to do any of those things. You might, right. But none of that is automatic. You do have, as humans, and I think this is very consistent with what we think about in Purposefully Human, give honor and respect to that very human trait of being able to choose how to respond.
But that choice, Jerry, is where the purposefully comes in.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the intentionality piece.
Yep. Yeah? Yep. And if we simply react in a habitual way, then we're not only lessening our humanity, I would argue, but we're not respecting the humanity of the person that we think did us wrong. For all the reasons you said, maybe they're on their way to the emergency room. Or, as I discovered recently on the highway here, they got cut off. And, or at least I think that's what happened. And in order to avoid getting hit by a semi truck, they reacted and they moved in front of me. That was not on their to-do list that day, but it was.
They didn't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to cut off Jerry Seufert.
I'm going to cut off Jerry. Yeah, absolutely. I've seen this guy around town. I'm cutting him off.
And then I'm flying over to Britain and I'm getting David Wales.
They were just reacting to traffic.
Hey, we're getting kind of towards the end of our hour, and this is fantastic. And the three of us could probably chat for another hour, easy. But I want to ask you something, and this is one of we always ask a burning question that we don't let you know anything about. I know we kind of set you up a little bit with some ideas of what we're going to talk about, but I want to ask you a question that if someone were to come up to you, and this could be anybody, and they wanted advice for how could I be more purposefully human every day? How could I be more purposefully human in what I do with my friends, with my family, with coworkers? What can I do? What's something I can, like Jerry said, what can I do? Get up in the morning and know I'm going to do this today. And I'm going to try to do it every day to be more purposefully human. What would that advice be from you, David?
Obviously, it depends on the individual, but I think that intentionality, for somebody, it may just be, I'm going to smile at 5 people today, or I'm going to do a random act of kindness, or I'm going to speak to somebody I've never spoke to. Or going back to Jerry's point, I think the nice thing about the things like, I suppose, the car and driving, you don't need to wait for the moment to react. You can give yourselves 2 or 3 phrases. So sometimes if somebody said, I disagree with your point, quite often that sets us into right, I'm going to defend. Actually, you can practice beforehand so it becomes a memory of a new response, which is, that's great, tell me more about why you disagree. And I think there's lots of things that we can start to do that are very small. And I would say do one at a time. Don't try and change everything, but just see how it goes. If it works, continue or do more of it. If it doesn't, ease back and either try to tweak it or try something different. But I think actually what we would generally be surprised about is this doesn't need massive changes to all the big things. If we could somehow watch ourselves or write a diary of, I suppose, over the course of a week, we would notice there are opportunities just to change some small things and actually have quite a big impact in doing that. The person that you you don't get on with or somehow always makes you upset, find a way to work out why that is and have a conversation with them. But actually, I always just say as well that you will end up with a behavior. So if somebody doesn't like sitting at the front of a conference, that creates a whole set of behaviors around that. So you may get really stressed because you want to make sure you get to the conference in time. Any delay makes you start feeling anxious. You'll miss the coffees and the networking beforehand because you're going to get and sit at the back. The thing to do at some point would be go and sit at the front and realize you're not going to, unless it's a comedy gig, you're not unlikely to get picked on. It's not so bad. You can see better. There's other benefits because once you've broken that bit, now you're not so worried about all the other bits that you've adapted around behind it. So I think just catch yourself with your habits, the things that maybe you could change, small things, or just be brave enough just to say, okay, well, this one time I'm going to go and sit at the front, and it worked. And so I advocate people just try and find something small that they can change, but keep with it for a few times, and then see how it works. And if it's not that,
that's
try
how you
something
make
different.
a habit. That's how you make habits. You got to
Exactly.
stick with it, and you keep doing it. Well, David, Jerry, I don't know if you've got something to add, but this is really all the time we have. And our sponsors will get upset if we go over. So
they'll cut our funding.
Jerry, you got any words of wisdom before David?
I just wondered if David had any coming attractions that he wanted to share about Purposefully Human, or not. I mean, it's always an opportunity to hear from you, which I frankly treasure. And otherwise, we'll save that. We can leave that as a teaser, and we can invite people to check out the LinkedIn group and the website. And we, of course, will be sharing this program as we've done with the others. So, I expect there would be an audience for any announcements that you're thinking of making in the near future. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, this is an exciting time for us. We're now moving from an informal community to an established organisation. We've recently been successful in applying to become a company limited by guarantee, so that we'll be a formal not-for-profit. That gives us new opportunities. We're updating the website, and really the aim is that we've done a lot of foundational work over the last few months, and that'll allow us to come into 2076 with, I think, a lot more new opportunities, hoping to increase our reach to provide more opportunities for people to work with us. As I say, we're not about telling people what to do. We're just trying to collate a lot of information and create a blueprint, the benefits, and help people take human ways of working into their organizations. But in doing so, we obviously value and hope that they will share with us what they've found that works and what they're trying. And so it's very much two-way. But yes, it's a really exciting time for us, and looking forward to 2026, and of course more listening to the radio hour, which we're always pleased to hear.
Well, thanks, David. I appreciate that, and I look forward to all of it. This is something I've gotten pretty passionate about, this organization. So I appreciate being part of all of this. It's exciting, and I appreciate you being with us today and sharing such great insight. Jerry, any final words before we let David go back to his life?
No, just personal appreciation to David. He mentioned how we've worked on this, 3 years now?
It is.
And it's been life-changing work, to be honest, for me. It's that opportunity to chomp down on these ideas and then bring them into your life and see what a difference that they can make in your circle. And then I don't remember which philosopher talked about dropping the pebble in the water, but you know what I mean, the ripples that go out, and the people that end up being influenced that you don't even know are being influenced. And we are beginning to see that. we've had a couple of our guests, for example, Lori Gray and Beth Carawan, that have embraced this way of thinking, and I know are sharing in their circles about Purposefully Human. And, that's the way the word gets out. Right, David? What do we always say? What's the purposefully human way to get the word out? One human to another. So I invite people to do what you suggested. Think about it. How do they do little things to get started? And join the conversation. There's no membership application. There's no fee structure. We welcome people who want to talk about this stuff, and hope that folks will.
Well, thank you, David, for being with us. Appreciate it. And we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Neal, Jerry, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thanks for staying and working late on a Friday night.
It never feels like work.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you.
We'll see you soon, David.
All right.
Okay,
Care.
bye then.
Jerry, we've got a couple of minutes. We've pushed this right to the edge, but I want to ask you, if you were to say one big takeaway, what would that be?
I think I just shared it. Encourage people to participate and, put into action in some small way the ideas that we talked about today.
Yeah.
We must have listed a dozen in rapid fire succession. Several of them I've done, and like I said, it's been life changing. I started smiling first, and it's infectious. Because I would say 95% of people smile right back, total strangers.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do it to get anything. I honestly do it to share a smile. And it makes me, well, okay, I've sort of gotten addicted to it, to be honest. When I smile first and then someone smiles back, I look at that as a little win.
Sure.
It's a small thing, but maybe in some small way. And the other thing I've also embraced, which is a small thing, is to use abilities I have to help people that don't have them. And
Mm-hmm.
to your book, willing to be inconvenienced. So I'm not a real tall guy, but I'm taller than some people. So when I'm in the grocery store and they're having trouble reaching the higher shelf, I don't mind stopping. This used to be an inconvenience. I walk right past the situation. Or the people in the carts, that didn't happen to bring a grabby stick with them that day, for whatever reason. They can't hardly reach anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes me like 3 seconds. Can I reach that for you? And half the time I end up having a long conversation with someone about, grocery stores aren't really designed for the people like us that are, in carts, and well, if you ever see me here, just ask. I'll be happy to help you reach that
Sure.
item. And connecting it, I think there is a connection between these small things. I think sometimes there's a tendency for people, well, what difference is that really going to make? Well, I think it does on two levels. One, it makes a big difference in your world and the world of the people you're interacting with. Don't underestimate how big that difference is. But as we talked about before in the book Hope for Cynics, we've got to get these small scale things right again, because the author, I think, correctly points out we've become a cynical, mistrustful society.
Yep.
If we want to take on the big problems, we have to become more welcoming, more trusting. And that starts, I was thinking about last story for today. Someone was attempting to send me a payment for some work I had done. and they were having trouble with their bank. And now, the person that was trying to send me the money didn't do anything wrong. So in earlier life of me, I might have gotten upset, but it was crystal clear that they had done their part and the bank screwed up. And I didn't get mad at the bank either, because they have their rules and their regulations, and like we were talking about before, they're kind of stuck with them for now until they have this epiphany that we've been talking about being purposefully human. So I used what I've learned, and I give David and you a lot of credit for this, so thank you very much, to pause and think about the person trying to send me the money. And I realized the very last thing he needs right now is for me to yell at him. I know he probably feels terrible. In fact, I know he did. I know this person really well. So if I get on his case too, not only is it not going to help, I might lose a friend. And because he can't fix the problem. If I just get angry and yell at him, isn't going to help. So how about, like you were saying before, gee, that's really terrible. Thanks for keeping me in the loop. I'm sure you've done everything you can do. I'll check back with you in a few days. And these are these micro settings that I think we need to get right more broadly, as we spread the word, so to speak. And they will, in turn, this is a new aha today from this conversation, in part inspired by the author of the Hope for Cynics book. Mm-hmm. If we get those transactions right, we can build a foundation to take on big issues.
Yeah.
But we can't take on big issues if people don't like each other, don't trust each other, they Correct. Can't talk to each other. And we're seeing that in so many situations, not just in this country, but around the world. Mm-hmm. Get the little stuff right, build on it.
I'm going to jump to my, because we're running into 5 minutes overtime. So I'm going to jump a couple of quick takeaways for me. One, I'm amazed at how similar David and I are in a lot of thinking. It just really stood out. A couple of things. One, he talked largely about conversation and how important conversation is, and language. And I'm big about all of those. I'm really big on the fact, the power of just holding conversations where we just bring this up and it starts to get in the air and people talk more about it. And the language we use makes a big difference. We did talk about the difference between onboarding and welcoming, and that's just one tiny little thing.
Yeah.
There's language that we can use differently that's more human than other language, right? And the final kind of big takeaway, and it's something else I talk about a lot, is it doesn't have to be big things. Yeah. It can be small things. I've got another book coming out in next year, and in it I talk about what you do doesn't have to be gigantic things. It can be little things, little changes, just a smile, just a this, just a that, just not it doesn't have to be earth shattering. But to your point earlier, and we're built this way, we're wired this way. If I do these things, there's a high likelihood that you will probably turn around and do the same thing for somebody. And we're built that way for a reason. And we don't have time to get into all that, but we are built a certain way for reasons that keep us alive and keep us thriving. So with that, I'm going to leave this. David was a fantastic guest. Jerry, You're always a great co-host. I appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. And we'll talk to you next time.
Yes, and thank you for great hosting as always, Neal.
All right.
Take care.
You too.